Hi, and welcome to this episode of The Life of Purpose. We're now at the third episode. We started off in the first episode where we were in the Garden of Gethsemane, and the first two stations really happened there, the Station of the Cross, the place that Jesus went often to be alone and to pray and relax. Then he was taken to where what we studied in the second episode. He was taken to the home of Caiaphas, the high priest, and there Jesus was brought up on charges, really trumped up charges with witnesses that were brought in. They were trying to move this thing along quickly. They wanted Jesus dealt with as fast as they could. And so after having that trial at Caiaphas' house, the scene moves again. And so in this third episode, we're really at the home of Pilate. And, well, not his home.
No.
He lived there, but it was a fortress called the Antonia Fortress, connected really to the temple area, because that's where most of the issues and things went wrong, where they needed soldiers to come to.
Right. Right. Pilate, normally, the Roman governor actually lived on the Mediterranean Sea in Caesarea by the Sea. City built by Herod the Great. It truly was a Roman city and had all the luxuries of a Roman city. And so the Roman governor always lived there. They only came to Jerusalem when they felt they had to. And Passover was one of those times, because this large number of Jewish people would be gathering in Jerusalem for the Passover. And so Pilate would come and he would arrive with a legion of soldiers, and he would be in his chariot, and it would be as much pomp and circumstance as possible for his arrival. And he would take up residence in Antonia Fortress, and there he would be able to flex the power of Rome if needed to keep the peace. And so that's where he was, and during this period of time. And so you can imagine the high priest and the chief priest and all of their soldiers and the members of the Sanhedrin all coming together in all their finest as the sun comes up, and they bring Jesus out of the pit again, and he's probably swelling from the beating that he's received and bruised because of that, and just disheveled as he could be. And now they're making him go to Pilate. And of course, when they get there, it's the Passover. They can't go in. And so they stand outside and demand that Pilate come to them. This is the audacity of these people that Pilate's having to deal with, because, and this is one of the struggles that every Roman governor has in Israel, is the unwillingness of the chief priest and the high priest and the Sanhedrin to bend in any way. And so they bring him and they set Jesus in front of Pilate when he comes out. And Pilate asked that great question, what accusation do you bring against this man? He knows this guy has to have done something horrible. Whatever the worst kind of crime that you can think of, that maybe you've watched on true crime on television or in a movie, whatever the worst crime imaginable, that has to be what this guy's done for this many people, this many notable people, to come and to bring him and stand him before me. And so Pilate, I think, probably at that moment was ready, pen in hand, to write down the long list of all of the accusations and all of the charges to be brought against him. What accusation do you bring against this man? And I always love the reply of the Sanhedrin. The high priest says, if this man were not a criminal, would we have handed him over to you? That's it.
Well, and they in other books, they start by saying he told people and encouraged them not to pay taxes.
Yeah.
Not really, and then they said, and he claimed to be a king.
Right.
And Pilate's looking at this guy who has no army, he's really never dealt with him as far as having other insurrection issues. And it's kind of like Pilate's going, is that all you got?
Yeah.
I mean, is there I'm waiting. Is there something better?
Right. He says, take him then, and why don't you just take him and judge him yourself according to your law? And they, like, at that point, double down. Because they look at Pilate and go, we're not permitted to put anyone to death. I can't imagine Pilate and what had to be running through his mind. Looking at Jesus, a person who's been beaten, who's been, who's bruised, who's standing in front of them, probably still in shackles and standing there without, Pilate probably has never heard of Jesus. It's not like this is some rebel that has been amassing an army in the Galilee, and Pilate's been watching him.
It's not. It doesn't have a rap sheet going.
No,
with
I mean,
Romans.
he's not among the the 10 most wanted of Israel. Pilate's never heard of this guy, and they want him put to death. They don't just want him tried and sentenced to go and spend 9 consecutive life sentences or something like that. It's, we want him put to death. We're not permitted to put him to death, so that's why we brought him to you. And so that's when Pilate says, I'm going to get to the bottom of this. And he takes Jesus inside. And he talks to Jesus one-on-one. And he looks at Jesus and he says, are you the king of the Jews? And he probably expected Jesus to say 1,000 things, to rant, to give all this illustration, or to talk about his lineage that goes back to the throne of David, or something. But instead, Jesus said, did you ask this on your own, or did somebody tell you this? And of course, Pilate goes, well, I'm not a Jew. I don't really care. I'm just asking, your own people, the people that like run your faith, your religion, your well, really the nature of your country, they've handed you over to me. What in the world have you done to make that crowd mad? And Jesus calmly says, my kingdom's not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my followers would fight to keep me safe and to make sure that all this went away. I wouldn't be handed over, but instead, my kingdom's not from here. And of course, Pilate says, so, wait a minute. If you have a kingdom, you're saying you're a king. And Jesus says, well, you say that I'm a king. I always like it when Jesus does that. That's one of those classic Jesus moves.
Yeah.
You say that I'm a king.
Well, and I love it because, by this point, Pilate's got to be thinking, I have a wackadoo on my hand who's talking about this mysterious kingdom that doesn't have any land with it.
Yeah.
It doesn't have any armies, really, with it. And what are you talking about? I mean, what?
Yeah.
How are you a threat to me?
Right. Right.
How are you a threat to Rome?
Yeah. I mean, Jesus and Pilate are having this conversation that is ethereal somewhat in nature. It's philosophical in nature. It's not a trial. It's not the conversation of somebody who is trying to get the answer and that I can save you, I can have you killed, I can do whatever. And Pilate's just confused.
Well, and it's also interesting that Jesus could have done so much to help his cause. Mm-hmm. To say, they're bringing up all these false accusations against me. I'm not a threat to Rome. I'm talking in religious terms. He could have really built the case. Now, I don't know what would have made a difference because ultimately they were so angry at Jesus that the bigger problem for Pilate wasn't whether or not Jesus, was some minor person who thought he had a kingdom. It's that the people outside who show up at, the crack of dawn are madder than anything and could start a riot.
Yeah.
And riots were not things that Roman governors liked.
No. They needed to keep peace. Their job was to keep peace in this country. And there had been a long list of Roman governors before Pilate, and there would be a long list of Roman governors after Pilate. And the main thing was to keep peace in Israel, in Judea. That was their job, because the Jewish people did not, by nature of following the law of God, they didn't blend in with the Roman government. They didn't blend in with Roman ways. They didn't conform and just say, oh, well, that Roman stuff sounds fun. Let's just do that now. They're still going to follow the 613 laws of the faith. And his job is to keep peace. And so he goes out to them, and he thinks that the crowd will work in his favor. Because maybe if the crowd gets on his side, then we can be done with this. It'll all be over. And so he walks out to them, and he has Jesus with him, and he simply says, you got a custom. Every year at Passover, I release someone to you. And it's somebody that's been in jail for whatever reason. I'll release them to you. Do you want me to release for you Jesus, King of the Jews? You want me to release him to you? After all, look at him. Or do you want me to release this Barabbas guy who is an insurrectionist? He's a troublemaker, murderer. He's got a long rap sheet on him. Do you want me to release this guy that's caused a lot of problems? Or do you want me to release Jesus? I'm sure in this moment he's thinking, I'm about done with this. All I got to do is get the first person to start saying Jesus, and the crowd will build, the energy will be there, everybody will be chanting Jesus, and it'll be great. The problem was, he underestimated the power of the priest and the Sanhedrin and their influence. And you can almost imagine that as soon as that option is given, one of that crowd, maybe the high priest, maybe a chief priest, maybe a Pharisee or a Sadducee, one of them says Barabbas. And as soon as they do, the crowd shifts. The wind, suddenly you can almost watch the wind blow the flags that way. Everything goes in that direction. Barabbas, Barabbas, release to us Barabbas becomes the chant. And Pilate has no choice. And Pilate doesn't know what to do. He doesn't know what to do with Jesus because he can't figure out why they want him tried, why they want him dead. But he releases Barabbas. And then he has to deal with Jesus. And so after Jesus is tried by Pilate, unfortunately, sadly, the next station in the Station of the Cross is Jesus is scourged. That's Pilate's answer.
Yeah, it's sort of a compromise. Like if we can almost kill him,
right?
Because scourging, you're beaten to the point of next to being dead,
right?
If we can almost kill him, then maybe that'll be enough, and they'll go, okay, he learned his lesson. And so they start mocking him, and they blindfold him, kind of spin him around, and I put a purple robe on him, and the thorns they find nearby, and they create it into a crown, and they're mocking him as being a king, and
they put a reed in his hand as a scepter, and then they'd take the reed from him because he was blindfolded, and they'd smack him on the head and say, "Now, prophesy, tell us who hit you." It's just one insult after another. The scourging. It's just impossible to think about the amount of pain that would go with that. They would use a cat of nine tails, which is a whip that has 9 little strips of leather that come off of it, and in each one of being hit with 9 strips of leather on a whip, now that's going to hurt anyway. But the Romans took it one step further, and they put little bits of metal and little bits of bone in the leather, so that when it hit you, not only did it hit you, it ripped flesh. And so you're getting beaten and you're getting cut. And the tradition was you only hit someone 39 times, because they fully believed that if you hit them 40 times, it would kill them. And so here's Jesus. He has been beaten and slapped and spat on by the guards and the Sanhedrin at Caiaphas' house. Here he is being beaten with a cat of nine tails, being scourged at Pilate's and at the Antonia fortress, a crown of thorns woven and shoved down on his head, and being hit in the head with a reed, with this purple robe being placed on his back that's probably, I can't imagine the wounds that would have been there that this robe is now pressed against. And he's got that on, and Pilate brings him back out and stands him back up in front of the people.
In this humiliated form.
Right. I mean, his last question was, do you want me to release for you Jesus, the King of the Jews, or this horrible insurrectionist? Now he brings out the King of the Jews again. And this time, he is a bloody mess and is humiliated. The look is, I can't imagine. And he says, here he is. Here is the man. And they still, when he asks, what do you want me to do? The crowd begins just to chant, crucify him, crucify him. And Pilate is just confused. He said, why don't you just take him and crucify him yourself? Because, I've done this. I didn't even want to do this. I've done this to appease y'all, and yet you're still screaming. But the priests say, we have a law. And according to our law, he ought to die because he's claimed to be the Son of God. Now, it's one thing if you're Pilate and you're dealing with somebody who is claiming to be the King of the Jews. The Jews were a people who are being occupied by the Roman government. You can be the King of the Jews, you can be the Duke of the Jews, the Earl of the Jews.
The Herod family was sort of the king.
The Herod family were the kings of the Jews right now, but they're really just sort of puppet people. They do whatever Rome tells them to do. And it's one thing to deal with that. But who would make the claim to be the Son of God? That seems to be enough to rattle Pilate. Rattle him enough that he takes Jesus back inside. This bloody mess. He takes him back inside and he looks at Jesus and says, where are you from? And Jesus chooses not to speak. He looks at Pilate. It says the scripture tells us he looks at Pilate. Pilate knows he's heard the question, but he doesn't speak. And Pilate now is getting so angry because you can feel the tension building in Pilate. Do you refuse to speak to me? What is this? Do you know that I have the power to release you? I have the power to crucify you. I have the power to do all of this. And you just imagine the look on Jesus' face in that moment. Through the blood that had to be there and the bruising and the swelling and all of that. He's not afraid. He's not beaten as far as losing here. Instead, he seems confident, and he actually seems compassionate when he looks at Pilate and says, you would have no power over me unless it has been given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of the greater sin. It's almost like he is telling Pilate, I know that you're doing what you have to do, they're making you do this. And I understand that. He goes back out to the people again, Pilate does, and he tries to release Jesus again. I mean, how many times does he have to go outside and say, hey, how about we just send him home now? And instead, when he goes back out, the priests maybe they had a meeting while he was inside. And this time when he comes back out, they tell him that if he releases Jesus, then Pilate is going against Caesar. Pilate is going against Caesar. And he makes that, I mean, he doesn't want that. I mean, Pilate's probably in Judea not because it was a reward. He's probably in Judea because something happened in his military career that was less than stellar.
It wasn't the tropics.
Right. He's not been sent to some wonderful island that would be it'd be great, always happy, always fun. No, he is in Israel. And it was not the best assignment to be a Roman governor. And so he doesn't want to make Caesar mad. So he goes over and he sits down on the judgment bench in front of the people. And he announces to them, here is your king. And the crowd, the high priest, the Sanhedrin, start yelling, away with him, crucify him, crucify him. And he says, you actually want me to crucify your king. And the high priest and the chief priests and the Sanhedrin, made up of the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the crowd that surrounded them, began to chant, we have no king but Caesar.
Which is blasphemy on their part.
On their part, right.
They wouldn't even carry a coin with Caesar's image on it, because that was a false image of a god, because Caesar wasn't just the king, he claimed to be divine.
Right.
And so they rejected that kingship. But here they are, to get this railroaded through, they'll do anything.
Anything at all. And so at that point, Pilate knew he was absolutely beaten. He had tried Jesus and found nothing. He had scourged Jesus to the near point of death. He had offered to release him and offered to release him and offered to release him. But now they have no king but Caesar. If you don't deal with him, if you release him and you don't deal with him the way we want you to, then you're not a friend to Caesar. And so Pilate actually sits down and washes his hands of the whole thing. And he sends Jesus off to be crucified. It's a whole scene that you can't imagine what Jesus is thinking and what Jesus is going through and the pain that Jesus has borne through this. And the amazing thing to me always is to think about the fact that he goes through all of this for us.
Absolutely.